Close your eyes. Feel the hush settle around your shoulders like velvet. You're safe now. The city has quieted, and the candle beside your bed flickers like a sigh. Let the cool air brush your cheeks. Let your thoughts slow until even time feels soft. Tonight, we drift through a place older than memory, where shadows stretch across stone and colors float like dreams. Only light. Our story begins in Paris, not the Paris of cafes and crowded corners, but the Paris that waits beneath inside cribs, behind doors that never creak, and high above, where no feet ever walk. Nestled beneath the old rose window of Notre Dame, hidden in a narrow chamber dusted with centuries, lives a girl named Céleste. She isn't a guide, nor a nun, nor a scholar. She tends to glass, bits of cobalt and crimson, melted long ago and spun into petals of story. Her fingers trace the edge of a broken pane violet etched in gold. It once belonged to the outer ring of the rose window, a panel lost during a long-forgotten storm. Tiny colored shards, like the ghost of a violin played only for her, always. She wears linen gloves to touch them. Even now, as rain taps gently against the cathedral's outer wall, Céleste hums softly under her breath. To others, it's simply glass. To her, it sings, not in words, not aloud. But when her fingers hover above it, a tremble stirs in her chest, a warmth. Céleste has never told anyone. She was found as a child beneath the cathedral steps, wrapped in a shawl embroidered with stars. No name. The sisters called her a gift. The choir called her strange. But the rose window, the window called her home. Even now, as she polishes the fragment, she pauses just for a second. Her head tilts. Her eyes flutter shut. Here, behind the rose window, a chamber curls like a hidden womb. No tourists, no priests. Just dust, glass, and the echo of centuries. There it is again. That hush. Even the restorers could not fix it. They called it an imperfection, a vibration just beneath sound. She sets the shard down carefully, beside dozens of others laid out like a mosaic of lost time. Then she moves to the tall arched window where scaffolding rises like bones above the apse. She climbs, not with fear, but reverence. The wooden steps groan softly under her slippers as she ascends to the clerestory level, high above the nave. And here is where the secret breeze. A tiny pane in the rose, one no larger than a palm, is loose. It has always been loose. But Céleste knows better. She kneels before it, breath fogging the stone mudge. Her gloved hand presses gently against the colored glass, and it shifts, not dangerously, delicately, enough to reveal the hollow behind. And in that hollow, always waiting, is a folded scrap of parchment, different every time, always sealed with red wax, stamped with the mark of a feather surrounded by stars. Her heart never races. Not anymore. She opens it and reads. The words shimmer faintly, as if inked in melted glass. Tonight, the humming will grow. Follow the color that doesn't exist. Céleste stares. Her fingers curl around the edges of the note. Then she turns and looks back at the rose. Cobalt, gold, ruby, emerald. All colors, all light. But somewhere in her chest, a new chord has begun to stir. A color she has never seen. Not yet. Céleste held the note between her gloved fingers, the wax seal now crumbling into soft flecks on the floor beside her knees. The words lingered in her mind like breath on a mirror, just to feel the shape of the mystery on her tongue. Follow the color that doesn't exist. The rain softened to mist. She could see the glass like veins of light held in stone. Each pane told a story. Apostles, angels. The colors remained. Saints with gold halos and blue robes that flickered in the sun. A low bell tolled across the Seine, one of the smaller ones, hidden in the towers far above, chiming not for the hour, but for the hush that came after. She whispered it, the window breath shadows. Outside, Céleste turned toward the rose window. From the chamber's side, but the sun had set. Now still, she felt it again. But which one didn't? Which hue whispered without pigment? Céleste stepped closer, lifting her hand to hover just above the glass. No warmth, no sound. But deep behind the surface, the pull. A pressure behind the eyes. A resonance behind the ribs. She moved her fingers slowly across the outer petals of the window, following the line of a crimson trumpet flower, then a circle of deep indigo, then a ring of gold that looked like the edge of a crown. Not missing, and they're just there like a hell breath escaping. She paused, a section of glass that caught no light. Not dark, absent, nose almost touching the pane, just something new. If absence could shimmer, she leaned in closer, it didn't feel wrong. Just different. The smell of old parchment and incense now carried something else, lavender and the faint coppery scent of old keys. The dust stirred, then rested softly against the strange petal. Her gloved fingertip hovered, a jolt behind her. She turned. No one. She saw a color that didn't belong to the world, like the wing of a dragonfly, but with veins of silver threading through it. She turned it in her hand. Just the soft hush of the upper chapel. She looked back. The pane was still, but on the ledge below it, the flame rose lazily, casting soft amber light across the room. A petal of glass. It hadn't been there before. Céleste bent to pick it up. It was translucent, and for a heartbeat, she blinked, and it was gone. Just pale gray now. But she felt its echo, like the chime of a bell you hadn't realized had stopped. She descended slowly from the scaffolding, still holding the glass. Below, in the stone chamber, the wind had shifted. She placed the strange petal next to the violet shard on her table. The hum returned stronger now, not in the glass, in her chest. She pressed a hand to her heart, breathing slow. The note had said tonight. Would the rose window shift again? Would the hidden writer send another message? And who were they? Céleste glanced at the folded parchment. Its edges were curling. As if it too were waiting, she placed a paperweight upon it, not to trap it, but to hold the promise in place. Then she crossed to the tiny hearth, lit only when the wind was sharp, and added a sliver of wood. She curled into her chair beside it, the strange petal held loosely in her palm, and listened, not to the rain, not to the bells, but to the hum behind all things, soft, ancient, and patient. The fire crackled gently, its flames licking the edge of the hearth with careful restraint, as if it too knew not to disturb the silence. Céleste sat motionless in the warmth, her knees pulled close, the dragonfly glass petal resting in her palm like a delicate thought. The note still lingered in her memory. Follow the color that doesn't exist. And now that she'd seen it, or almost seen it, it was as though the world had shifted its skin. The chamber walls, once just stone and soot, now seemed to hum faintly, or maybe it was her. She turned her head toward the small wooden cabinet tucked beneath the ledge, where she stored the old glass catalogs. And forgotten fragments pieces unfit for the great windows, too flawed or cracked, but too beautiful to throw away. A whisper, not from the cabinet, but from behind it, barely a breeze. Still, she stood and crossed the room, each step soft as breath. The cabinet was heavy, but Céleste knew how to coax it aside without making a sound. Was a letter. She had moved it before, when one of the older sisters misplaced a ledger. But tonight, as she nudged it to the left, a faint rustle met her ears. And there, tucked into a seam in the stone, no wax seal this time, no color on the paper, just plain faded parchment. She reached for it with reverent hands, smoothing it open atop the table, beside the other note and the strange petal. There was no writing. Not at first. She tilted her head, held it to the firelight. Nothing, but then she moved it slowly past the flame, just close enough for warmth, not enough for scorch. And the letters began to appear, one by one. Lines drawn in silver, not ink, not charcoal, but something that shimmered only under heat. Beneath the saint who weeps, the truth waits with closed eyes. She leaned closer and read, "When the bells ring 7 and 1, go where the rose cannot see." She whispered it aloud, her voice no more than a feather's sigh. The kind of riddle found in medieval manuscripts and carved above archways no one looked at anymore. 7 and 1, 8 bells. The cathedral's bells rang often matins, vespers, and all hours in between, but the phrasing was old. 7 and 1. She rose and moved to the tall cabinet where she kept the architectural maps of the cathedral, folded diagrams passed down through generations of glaziers and keepers. She unfurled the parchment onto the stone floor, weighed down at the corners with fragments of smooth quartz. Her eyes scanned the towers, the naves, the crypts, and there on the eastern transept stood the statue of Saint Genevieve. The weeping saint, the stone figure that had stood since the 13th century, said to have been sculpted with a tear at her cheek to mourn the lost books of the old library. Céleste had visited that wing only once. It was cordoned off, rarely opened. She looked at the note again. Beneath the saint, the crypt. That would be it. A room few knew of, tucked beneath the old floor tiles. She folded the letter, this one carefully. The silver ink might not return if lost. Then she looked at the fire again. The strange petals still lay on the table. She picked it up and tucked it into her satchel. The air had shifted. She could feel it in her bones. And somewhere beyond the high arches and flickering candles, a bell began to ring. 7 chimes. Then 1. The 8th bell echoed through the cathedral like a whisper folded in bronze. It did not shout. It simply arrived, carried on the silence between shadows, gliding down stone columns and across the cool tiled floor of the transept like a ripple through glass. Céleste stood at the threshold of the eastern wing, her satchel pressed gently to her hip, the note still warm from the hearth tucked carefully beside the strange petal. Saint Genevieve waited at the far end of the hall. The statue stood nearly 3 meters tall, carved from pale limestone that had taken on the color of centuries bone white streaked with ash. Her eyes downcast, gazed toward the floor. Her mouth was neither smile nor frown, but on her cheek, the faintest trace of a tear. No one remembered who carved it. Her shadow stretched before her, lit by the single flame flickering in the brass holder at the statue's feet. No one remembered why, but the tear had never weathered away. As Céleste stepped closer, her soft slippers made no sound on the mosaic tile. The saint held a book in one hand, closed, in the other a key. The key had always been part of the statue. Decorative, cast in her hand, smooth and polished, like a prayer frozen in stone. But tonight, the flame shifted, and for the briefest moment, the key glinted. Metal, not stone. Céleste blinked. She reached toward it, hesitant, then wrapped her gloved fingers gently around the key. It was cold, real, and loose. She gave the slightest tug. With a soft click, the key lifted from the saint's palm. The book didn't change. The face didn't move. The tear remained, but beneath the statue's pedestal, just beside the worn base where hundreds of solas had passed across the years, was a seam, thin, delicate, nearly invisible. But it hummed beneath her fingertips. Céleste knelt and brushed her palm along the seam. A cool draft whispered against her skin. She fit the key into the groove beside it and turned, spiraling down into earth. A low click echoed like a forgotten breath. The other wrapped around a small lantern she lit with trembling matches. Then the stone slid back, not with noise, but with reverence. Beneath it, stairs. Narrow, she swallowed gently, not from fear, but from the weight of something beginning. Pulling her shawl tighter across her shoulders, she stepped downward, one hand against the wall. The flame caught and held steady, casting golden light that danced along the walls. Each step was cool and slick. Dust bloomed in her lungs, ancient and dry. Beneath the cathedral, time didn't move. It waited, At the bottom of the spiral, the stone gave way to a chamber, small, silent, lit only by the light she carried. And there, resting atop a pedestal no taller than her waist, was a mirror, round, framed in iron, its surface fogged. She stepped toward it, the lantern in one hand, the other slowly extending toward the glass. As her fingers neared it, the fog began to lift. But not because of the heat. The mirror exhaled. And when she looked inside, she did not see her own reflection. She saw the rose window, not from within the cathedral, but from outside, floating in air as if the city had vanished and the sky had folded itself into petals of light. And in the very center, where the color that didn't exist had shimmered, there was now a door, carved of glass and light and silence. The mirror pulsed once, then the image vanished. Céleste pulled her hand back. Her chest rose and fell. The note had said to come beneath the saint. It had told her the truth, waited with closed eyes. This was not a secret someone wanted found by accident. It was a path, left only for her. She stared at the mirror once more. The iron frame was etched with small symbols, stars, feathers, and the outline of a bell. The same mark on the wax seals of the letters. She knelt and waited. She didn't know why, but her heart told her this part of the story did not begin with movement. It began with stillness, so she breathed. And the mirror watched her, as though it remembered her, as though it too had been waiting. Céleste knelt in front of the mirror, her lantern dimming ever so slightly, its flame drawing closer to the wick like a sleepy eye. She did not speak. She simply listened. The silence of the chamber was not hollow, it was full of stillness that felt ancient and kind, as if the walls had grown used to being unseen and welcomed her presence with a long-held breath. In her satchel, the strange petal of glass vibrated faintly. Not with heat, not with movement, with memory. She drew it out carefully and held it in her palm, allowing the flickering light to catch its shimmer. As soon as she did, the mirror responded. The iron frame warmed, not with fire, but with a sense of yes. Its surface rippled like a pond brushed by wind. Then the whisper came. Not a voice, not a sound. A feeling like a thread pulling from the chest outward, a thought not hers. Bring the petal to the surface, where the sky can see, and sing. Céleste blinked. She was not a singer. She had never sung aloud, not since she was a child hidden beneath cathedral steps, listening to choirs through stone and wood. She opened her mouth once now, but nothing came out. Just the rush of her heartbeat behind her ears. The mirror's shimmer slowed. Still it pulsed, waiting. Céleste stood, lantern in one hand, the petal in the other, and no voice on her tongue. But something in her had shifted. She returned to the stairway and climbed in silence, up from the crypt, past the saint's stone tier, through the eastern wing, now dark and dreaming. She didn't return to her chamber. She didn't go to the hearth or the ledgers or the scaffolding. She went straight to the nave, the grand open space beneath the rose window. And there beneath the glass that had always pulled her gaze upward, she stood looking up. The window was dark in the night, but not empty. The moon, hidden behind thin clouds, cast just enough silver to outline its petals. And in the very center, a flicker, as if the absent color was beginning to remember itself. Céleste stepped forward. She crossed the worn stone floor until she stood directly beneath the window. And then she did the unthinkable. She began to hum. It wasn't a song she knew. Not one she had learned. It came from the base of her ribs, moved like warm water into her throat, and slipped into the air like a bird leaving its nest. Low, soft, uneven at first, but true, and above her, the rose window began to shimmer, not brightly. Not like sunlight or candle flame, like breath-fogging glass. Like tears that haven't yet fallen. The absent color, whatever it was, began to stir behind the center of the rose. She raised the petal. The glass in her hand shimmered with the same impossible hue, and for the briefest instant, the entire cathedral seemed to lean forward, listening. Céleste let her hum stretch into a note, then another, and suddenly she wasn't alone, not with people. No one had entered, but the presence returned. From behind the stone, from the mirror in the crypt, from the broken petals on her table, the air around her thickened with it, not heavy, full. Then somewhere above she heard the softest sound. A chime, not the bell tower, not a clock, just a note. Perfect, ringing from the window itself, as if the color had found its pitch. Céleste stopped humming. The chime held a second longer, then faded. But it left something behind, not sound, not light, a direction. The petal in her palm turned cold, and for the first time, its surface cracked. One fine line down the center, inside it barely visible, was an etching. A feather inside a star, and below it, the number 3. Céleste stared. Not in fear, in recognition. She had seen other petals, other fragments. This one was part of something larger, and she had just awakened it. The petal glinted in her palm, its thin silver fracture glowing faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the high window above. Céleste turned it over carefully, the etched 3 dancing across her skin like a soft whisper in motion. There were more, at least 2 that came before, perhaps others after. And if this one had called to her in the stillness, what of the others? Where had they gone? Who had touched them? Did they hum too? The air around her felt fuller than before, not loud, but weighted like snow moments before it falls. She glanced toward the rose window once more. The central pane still shimmered, just a breath more vivid than the rest, then faded. Stillness returned, but inside her movement, she returned to her chamber, the echo of her hum still drifting faintly along the nave like a scent not yet gone. The moment her slippers touched the familiar rug near the hearth, she knew something had changed. The air was warmer, and on her table, beside the curled edge of the silver-lettered parchment, lay another fragment. She gasped, and unlike the first, which had shimmered almost invisibly, this one pulsed with a faint warmth. It hadn't been there before. This one was slightly larger than the first, deeper in tone, an opaque sapphire veined with honey gold. She brought it to the light, a fine etching curled across its edge, elegant, deliberate. A feather, a star, and the number 1. Céleste placed it beside the other, hands trembling just slightly. First, third. They did not fit perfectly together, not in shape, not in edge. But they vibrated in harmony, 2 low chords of the same silent song. Where was the second? She unrolled the cathedral's old map again. This time she scanned it not for saints or staircases, but for echoes, places that might carry a hum. Her fingertip traced across the diagram until it landed on a name, Chapelle de la Lune, the moon chapel, rarely used now. It was tucked behind the southern cloister, walled with stone that drank candlelight, where old manuscripts were once kept beneath seal and guard. She had never been inside, but the name. It hummed in her mind the same way the petal had in her chest. She glanced again at the 2 fragments on the table, then tucked both into a velvet cloth and slipped them into her satchel. She would go tonight. The bells had not yet struck midnight. The air was clear and the halls empty. She moved through the cathedral with practiced grace, her lantern lighting her path in soft golden arcs. Her shadow danced beside her, long and quiet. As she reached the cloister door, she paused. It was older than most in the cathedral, carved from dark yew wood, wrapped with black iron bands and a latch that creaked like an old whisper. She pressed gently, round like a pocket of breath hidden in the cathedral's ribs. Moonlight spilled through a narrow window cut high into the dome, scattering pale shapes along the walls like drifting feathers. It opened with a sigh, Inside, the moon chapel slept. Its walls were curved, unlike the grand chambers of the main nave. Céleste stepped inside. Immediately, the fragments in her satchel warmed. She closed the door behind her and walked to the center of the room, where an old stone pedestal stood beneath the beam of light. Nothing sat upon it, but as she drew closer, her eyes caught something strange etched faintly around the pedestal's base. Letters, not Latin, not French. Shapes, petals, a circle, and inside that circle, an indentation, the shape of a fragment. Céleste reached into her satchel and withdrew the sapphire petal marked 1. It fit, exactly. As soon as it touched stone, the entire pedestal pulsed with warmth. The air trembled. Her other fragment in her palm hummed in reply, and from the shadowed edge of the chapel, a sound emerged, not words, not voice, just a chime, soft, twice, then silence. The chime echoed twice, and then all was still. Céleste stood by the pedestal, breath slow, the sapphire petal now resting inside the carved indentation. It pulsed with quiet warmth, subtle, like the heat that lingers in stones after a summer sunset. She kept her hand above it, palm hovering, not to disturb, only to feel. The second petal in her hand, the third, marked with a 3, vibrated softly in answer. 2 petals, and a missing second. But there had been 2 chimes. The chapel was quiet, but not empty. Her ears strained, not for sound, but for movement beneath silence. 2 clear notes, as if the chapel itself had confirmed their presence. She turned slowly in place, letting the lantern's flame paint the curved walls in slow arcs of gold and shadow. There along the far side, half hidden by a crumbling tapestry, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A groove in the wall, vertical, thin, as if a seam had been carved and then forgotten. She approached slowly, pushing aside the tapestry with fingers barely touching the fabric. Dust curled into the air like old breath, the same way it had in the crypt, the same way it had when the petal sang. The seam was stone, or so it seemed. But as she brushed her hand along the line, her skin tingled. Something was waiting. She lifted the lantern and looked closer. No handle, no lock. But at the base of the seam, etched into the stone, was a tiny symbol, a rose, not in bloom, just a bud, closed tight. And beneath it, in the smallest possible line of silver script, were the words, "Speak what cannot be seen." Céleste stepped back. The mirror had asked her to hum. The rose had sung, but this, a phrase, a riddle. She whispered it aloud. Speak what cannot be seen. Was it silence? A color? A name? She thought of the color that didn't exist. She thought of the moment it shimmered behind the rose window like breath behind glass. She thought of the hum in her chest. She closed her eyes and she sang. It wasn't a song. She let it stretch until her voice vibrated against the air. Not exactly. It was a tone held soft and long like a held breath, low and round and full of sleep. And Nassim responded, a soft click. Then the wall opened inward, no louder than a sigh. A narrow passage lay beyond, dark save for a single crystal, hanging from the ceiling by a fine thread of iron. It glowed, pale blue. Céleste stepped inside. The walls were smooth, too smooth, not like carved stone or plaster, more like glass sanded by time. Her footsteps made no sound. The corridor curved slightly, and she followed the bend until the path opened into a small circular chamber. There, on a pedestal like the one in the moon chapel, rested the second petal. It was unmistakable. Emerald green, translucent like forest light at dawn, threaded with gold veins. She approached it slowly. The petal lifted from the pedestal on its own, drifting gently upward before settling into her hand like a falling leaf. It was warm, buzzing faintly. Etched upon it again, the star, the feather, and this time, too, Céleste smiled. She didn't know why. But the feeling of the pieces coming together stirred something bright in her, like a note held too long, finally resolving into harmony. She turned to leave, the 3 petals now wrapped carefully in her satchel. But before she stepped from the room, her eyes caught a glimmer along the edge of the crystal light. Another carving, this time not words, an image. The rose window drawn in delicate, overlapping circles, and within it, a door. And beyond that door, a garden. Céleste stepped out from the narrow corridor, her lantern held high, the emerald petal cradled gently in her palm. It shimmered against the glow of the crystal behind her, a piece of something ancient and precise, fragile, yet humming with memory. The pedestal still glowed faintly where the sapphire petals sat, the warmth rising like soft wind from a hearth. Arranged in order, they formed a curve, not quite a circle, but close enough to whisper its shape. She returned to the moon chapel quietly, her footsteps reverent, as if afraid to startle the silence now breathing all around her. One by one, she laid the petals before it, first the emerald, then the silver-veined, and finally the sapphire. She watched, waited, and then from the stone beneath the pedestal, a low resonance began. It was not music, it was intention. The kind of sound that exists just before a song is born. A prelude only silence can understand. She knelt beside the pedestal, pressing her ear to the smooth surface, and there it was again. The same hum she had heard beneath the rose window, the same harmony that had laced her breath in the crypt. Each petal was part of a song, but not to be sung with voice. They were to be placed, fitted. She stood and reached into the side pocket of her satchel, where the cathedral's ancient architectural map had been tucked, folded, and fraying. She spread it on the chapel floor, weighed down its edges with smooth stones, and studied the lines, old, faded, but still readable. She wasn't looking for saints this time. She wasn't looking for stairwells. She was looking for circles. 3 stood out, each the same size, each marked not with names, but with symbols. One a feather, another a bell, and the third a flower bud. Her heart beat gently against her ribs. The petals were meant to return, not to her table or her satchel or her dreams, but to the cathedral itself. She traced her finger from the moon chapel toward the central apse, then to the cloistered alcove near the choir, and lastly to the old scriptorium behind the sacristy. She had walked those spaces before. Each one was drawing her toward something, some forgotten song, buried beneath dust and stone. Passed by them in candlelight, wrapped the petals, and moved toward the first location, the apse. But she had never listened, not until now. She saw the marking. She gently lifted the petals once more, their warmth pulsing faintly in her fingertips. Céleste packed her lantern. It was the most sacred of spaces, behind the altar. High above it, the rose window sat in silence, and beneath it, a hollow etched into the floor, worn by time, shaped like the curve of a petal. She knelt and placed the sapphire one first. It clicked into place with a sigh, as if returning home. A note rang through the air, just one, deep and low, but not loud. It echoed gently and faded. She smiled. The first was returned, like light on water. She turned to the second location behind the choir. The narrow hallway curved with aged arches, stone ivy crawling across its spine like frozen song. Behind the sacristy, where the scriptorium had once bustled with quills and vellum and flickering lamplight, it was empty now, sealed by time. At its center, another hollow. The emerald petal fit perfectly, and again a chime. Softer, the third location lay deeper, but Céleste found the mark, silence. And when she laid the final silver-veined petal into its cradle, a third note joined the others. 3 tones, each distinct, and then, but not absent. Readiness, the sound had changed, not louder, not clearer. Just nearer, the window above her began to glow. And in its heart, the unseen color, the color that did not exist, bloomed softly, pulsing in rhythm with her breath. The color shimmered above her, no hue she could name, no light she had ever seen. It danced in the center of the rose window like a secret unfurling, a breath held for centuries and now slowly released. Céleste stood beneath it, her hands clasped, her shawl pulled close. The cathedral was quiet, the hour late, but the air trembled with something alive. She listened. 3 petals placed. 3 notes given. What now? She had once heard a tale, told in a whisper by the former archivist, an old woman with soft eyes and a voice like worn velvet. There was a memory tugging at her thoughts, something from her earliest days in the cathedral, when she was still a child too young to light candles, but old enough to wander the forgotten halls. She'd said, "When the rose begins to glow, seek not the door you can see, but the one in the floor beneath the 4th stair." Céleste hadn't understood then. She had been small, distracted by dust motes and sunbeams, but now it rang true. She returned to the main stairs at the western transept, counting slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4. The stone beneath the 4th stair looked no different. But when she knelt and pressed her palm against it, her breath caught. It was warm, just slightly, not from sun or flame, from remembrance. She ran her fingers along the seam and felt the familiar pull of something hidden, waiting. There was no key this time, no carved lock, but the notes, the petals, they were the key. She leaned down and whispered not a word, but a tone, soft, steady. The same note the petals had offered, and the stair responded. A low click, a tremble beneath her knees. Then stone shifted. The stair lifted at an angle, revealing a hollow beneath it. Inside, a book, bound in midnight blue leather, fastened with a single clasp, and a rose pressed into the cover, flattened, silver, and closed. Céleste reached in and lifted it gently, the weight of it far heavier than it seemed. She undid the clasp. The same hue that bloomed now in the rose window. The book opened, but instead of words, the first page was filled with pressed petals. Dozens, all shades blue, green, silver, and one she couldn't describe. Each petal was labeled with a number, a symbol, a single note drawn on a thin line. It was not a journal, it was music. A symphony made of glass and light and memory. Each petal was a note, each fragment a part of the cathedral's long-forgotten song. She turned the pages slowly, reverently. Some were missing, others faded. But the first 3 hers matched those on the opening page. They had been returned. At the bottom of the 3rd page was a small line of script, written in delicate, old French. "When the song is whole, the garden will rise." She closed the book carefully and cradled it against her chest. There were more petals out there, scattered, waiting, and she was not the first to seek them. But perhaps, if she listened closely, she could be the first to finish the song. The cathedral held its breath. Outside, the first gray hints of morning traced the sky, but inside, all was still lit by lantern light and memory. Céleste returned the book gently to her satchel, wrapping it with a piece of linen worn thin by time. The clasp clicked shut with a sound softer than thought. She stepped away from the stair, the hollow resealing behind her as if it had never opened. Only her breath and the faint hum of the petals reminded her it had. She moved toward the western transept, the high arches looming like sleeping giants above her. Somewhere in this vast, dreaming house of stone, more fragments waited. Notes that had once filled this place with music that could be felt through walls, and perhaps heard by the garden. She remembered something else the archivist had murmured long ago, on an afternoon when the sun painted prisms across her ink-stained fingers. The bell without a rope never rings for men. Only when the song is sung does it chime again. A bell without a rope. She'd thought it a fable, a turn of phrase. The cold stone pressed against her slippered feet, each step echoing upward like a distant drumbeat. But now she felt it. Somewhere in the cathedral, there was such a bell, and it was waiting. She climbed the spiral stair toward the bell tower, heart calm, mind open. Near the top, she paused. The great bells of St. Celestine hung silent, their ropes long removed, now operated by the newer mechanisms built after the fire. But one space, one alcove near the top, was always empty. No bell, just a wooden bracket carved with stars and ivy, and a ring of dust where something had once rested. She approached it. The air was cooler here, threaded with the scent of old metal and lofted doves. As her lantern illuminated the bracket, she saw something else. Etched into the wood, nearly erased by time, were 3 notes drawn on a musical staff. She recognized them instantly. The sapphire, the emerald, the silver veined. Their notes had echoed earlier when she returned the petals. Beneath the staff was a space, circular, the shape of a bell's base. But no bell hung there now. Only an outline, and within it tiny carvings. Petals, 9 of them. The petals matched the first 3 etched on the page. Some darkened, some faint, a tone. But 3 glowed faintly as the lantern light brushed over them. Celeste's breath caught. A step toward something ancient, her 3 petals had awakened this. She stepped closer, lifted the old book from her satchel, and held it beside the carving. Each note was a petal, each tone. She knelt beside the bracket, and then, for the first time, she noticed something no one had mentioned. Beneath the wooden mount, hidden behind a small carved panel of ivy and bird wings, was a single word, barely readable. Jardin, garden. She closed her eyes. The rose window, the petals, the bell without a rope. They were leading her there, but where? The cathedral had no garden, none that she'd ever seen. The grounds beyond were paved in stone and moss. No record of a garden remained in the archives, but if the garden was lost, perhaps it wasn't gone, perhaps it was sealed, waiting for the song, waiting for the bell to ring once more. She stood slowly. The wind outside stirred through the high arches, and with it, a sound. A whisper, not of words, but of roots moving beneath stone, of blossoms dreaming beneath centuries of silence. Céleste looked out over the city below, where dawn began to stir in faint silver strokes. The garden was real, and it was listening. Céleste descended the tower with the music still blooming in her chest, the notes repeating softly, each one trailing behind her like petals on the wind. Her slippers moved silently over the worn steps, and as she passed beneath the rose window once more, the unseen color pulsed once soft, reassuring like a heartbeat. The book lay heavy in her satchel, not from weight, but from memory. 9 petals, 3 returned, 6 still waiting. And yet, the carvings and whispers seemed to suggest the garden would respond to more than just the final note, that it had already begun to stir. She could feel it in the floors and the hush between chimes, but where could a garden grow in stone? Most monks avoided this place now. The dust had grown thick, and the walls held whispers only those who truly listened could hear. She lit a fresh candle and traced her way to the cathedral's oldest records, buried in the scriptorium's vault. She opened a scroll case carefully, unfurling brittle vellum, maps, timelines, renovations. Her fingertip glided over lines and annotations until she found a symbol tucked into the corner of a page dated 1213, a rose, small, tucked beside the south transept, labeled simply Jardin de Silence, the Garden of Silence. It no longer existed on any modern drawing, vanished beneath later expansions, absorbed by stone and ambition, but it had been there. Céleste leaned closer. Just beyond the south cloister, where now stood only a sealed archway and a wall covered in ivy stone. The space was cool still. Morning had fully arrived outside, but the sun's rays barely touched this wall. She closed the scroll, heart steady, and made her way through the cathedral's winding corridors until she reached the cloister as end. And there it was. The archway, tall, carved, forgotten, covered in moss, but unmistakably adorned with vines and roses, each petal worn soft by centuries of rain and wind. She approached it slowly, fingers brushing against the stone. No door, no handle, just a wall where an entrance once lived. And in the very center of the arch, nearly invisible, a circular indentation. Not for a key, for a petal. She reached into her satchel and removed the book, opening to the first page. The 3 placed petals were drawn there, faintly glowing. Below them was a new line of script, freshly awakened by her touch. Place the 4th, and the gate shall stir. Céleste sighed gently. She did not yet have the 4th petal. But now, she knew where it must lead. The garden was real. It slept behind this wall. And with each petal returned to the world, it stirred a little more. Not loud, not fast, like spring beneath snow. She rested her hand against the stone once more, and for just a moment, she thought she heard it breathe. The soft breath beneath the stone had faded, but it left behind a certainty something lay waiting beyond that wall. Céleste stood before it a moment longer, her fingers tracing the grooves of ancient carvings where roses and stars wound like music in ivy. Then she turned, candles still lit, and made her way back through the cool hush of the cloister. She needed to find the 4th petal, and she knew, with a kind of intuition born not of logic, but listening, that it would not be found on parchment or map. No, this one would require memory. Not hers. Jean had not spoken much in years, but her eyes held oceans of stories, deep and still, like wells of time. But someone else's. She returned to the librarian's quarters, where old Jean sometimes kept the oldest oral tales. Céleste knocked softly on the carved door. "Child," Jean whispered, before the door had fully opened. "You're looking for the one in the stone, aren't you?" Céleste froze. Jean only smiled and gestured for her to come in. The room smelled of lavender and dust, the kind of scent that calms rather than unsettles. Books were stacked like towers, but Jean moved between them as if the paths had been carved into her soul. "The 4th petal," she murmured, sinking into a low chair beside a hearth gone cold, rests where the choir once wept. Céleste's brow furrowed. They never cleared the ruins entirely. Too many memories. Too much ash? The choir? Jean nodded slowly. She turned to the narrow stairway beside the pillar of St. Alban, a stair no longer used, barred by a low wooden gate, dusty and forgotten. Not the one you know now. The old choir, buried beneath the west transept after the fire. She leaned closer, eyes glittering like candlelight in a mirror. Just hush like a breath drawn in and never quite let go. They say the stones still echo the songs that were never finished, that if you stand very still, you can hear their last hymn, and what remained of an altar cracked straight through its heart. Céleste thanked her gently, squeezing her hand, and left the quarters with her satchel tucked tight. She crossed the cathedral to the west transept once more, but this time not to climb. She stepped over it, lantern raised. The staircase curved tightly downward. The air changed. It was colder here, but not sharp. The ruins of the old choir came into view, slowly, stone columns broken and leaning. Pews half buried in dust. She stepped lightly, as if her own feet might disturb the hymns still lingering, and then she heard it, faint, a note, a single tone sung by no lips. It came from the broken altar. She approached, and there, tucked between the stone fissures, lay a shape. Green-gray, soft-edged, and humming gently. A petal, this one etched with a symbol she hadn't seen before, a single tear. And beneath it, 4, she reached out. The moment her fingers touched it, the note vanished, and in its place, a whisper threaded through the vault. Only those who finish the song may cross. Céleste held the petal close, her chest warm. She had 4 now. And with this one, the gate would stir. Céleste cradled the 4th petal in her hand as she retraced her path. her steps slow and careful through the cathedral's sleeping halls. The old choir behind her was already returning to silence, the note it had sung now folded back into dust. The petal pulsed faintly. Its edges were green-gray, but at the center, a single thread of deep gold ran through it, like light seen through tears. She reached the cloister once more. The hidden archway stood just as before, cloaked in carved ivy and shadows. But now, with the fourth petal in hand, she noticed something new. A shimmer in the air, barely there, like heat above a candle, only colder. She stepped forward and knelt before the stone wall, pressing the petal gently into the circular indentation at its center. The fit was perfect. There was no sound, only warmth. The stone trembled, and then it breathed. Just once, a low exhale from the heart of the wall, as if it had held something in for too long. A thin line of golden light traced the edge of the archway, spreading slowly like ink on silk. Then the stone split without sound, without force opening inward, revealing a passage lit by no flame. It glowed on its own, cool and silver blue, like moonlight made solid. Céleste held her breath, heart stilled, and stepped inside. The air was different, soft. It carried the scent of old rain and crushed leaves, of blossoms long since dried. The floor was smooth stone, but speckled with moss, as though nature had crept in slowly, silently, over centuries. She walked deeper, and then the passage ended in a chamber, with walls that curved like petals closing, small, round. In the center, a basin, stone carved, empty save for a single metal stem rising from its heart, atop which perched an object unlike any she had seen before. A bell. No rope. No clapper. Just a hollow shape of pale gold, etched with lines that spiraled like vines. And surrounding it 6 indentations, petal-shaped. Céleste stood very still. 4 of them glowed faintly now. She hadn't brought them physically, but still the basin knew. The bell pulsed once, faint and blue, a breath without wind. She leaned forward, letting her hand hover above it. The air around the bell felt charged, not dangerous, but sacred, a kind of waiting. The petals were part of its voice. When all mine were returned, the bell would ring. Not with sound, but with memory. And perhaps, if the whispers were true when the bell rang, the garden would open, not a garden of flowers alone, but of remembrance, of all that had been lost, and all that longed to return. Céleste sat beside the basin, the quiet pressing gently against her skin like a soft evening breeze. She watched the faint blue glow of the bell, its surface carved with sigils that pulsed as if sensing with her heartbeat. Around it, 4 petal-shaped indentations shimmered, already filled by song and silence. 5 remained. She withdrew the book once more from her satchel, the velvet cover now warm to the touch. The clasp lifted easily, and when she opened it, she found that the 4th petal's illustration had bloomed, its note added to the staff, its color subtly glowing. Beneath it, new script had appeared. Almost hesitant, delicate. The 5th waits in the wind that does not move, beneath the wings that never flew. Céleste stared for a long moment. The wind that does not move. The phrase echoed in her mind like the distant toll of a forgotten chime, and then she remembered. High above the northern nave, beyond the arched ribs of the cathedral's oldest ceiling, was a statue, an angel carved into the wall, wings folded tight, eyes closed, mouth parted as though caught mid-song. She had passed it often. A few distant voices from the nuns' quarters hummed low prayers, but Céleste walked unheard. Most did not notice. It sat behind the organ loft where visitors rarely looked, too high and shadowed. She made her way through the corridor, candle in hand. The cathedral above had begun to stir with morning song. She reached the spiral stairs that led to the organ gallery. The dust here was untouched. Even her footprints from weeks before had faded. As she ascended, the wind outside began to pick up, whistling gently through the stained glass. But in this space, directly beneath the carved angel, there was no breeze at all. The wind did not move. But inside, nestled among lichen and bits of fallen mortar, was a single petal. She stepped to the center of the gallery. The angel watched, its stone wings pressed against the wall. Its face half turned as if trying to listen to something just out of reach, and at its feet, a small alcove. It looked like part of the architecture, easily mistaken for a candle recess, white, with a hint of blush at the edges, the fifth. She reached in gently, lifting it with reverence. It was lighter than the others, cooler, but the hum was there, delicate, like the first sigh before sleep. On the underside, the same symbol as in the book had been etched faintly, a feather crossed with a broken circle. The wind that does not move. The wings that never flew. She pressed the petal to her lips, then tucked it between the pages. As she turned to go, the angel above her seemed quieter, not in silence, but in peace. Céleste returned to the hidden chamber slowly, the white blush petal tucked safely in the book, its hum now a soft companion to her steps. Each time she passed through the ivy-laced archway, she felt it more clearly. This space had memory. It knew her now. It welcomed her. Inside, the basin pulsed. One more petal had been returned, and a fifth indentation now glowed, completing more than half of the ring around the bell. The light around the chamber brightened just slightly, as though each petal fed it, color by color, tone by tone. She opened the book again, and the new petal unfurled across the page with a whisper of wind that wasn't there. More writing had appeared, trailing gently beneath the fifth. Seek the ember that sleeps in ash, where hands once warmed but never stayed. Céleste closed her eyes. The hearth. Not the modern one in the librarian's quarters, the original. There was one old and unused in the forgotten refectory, once a dining hall for monks centuries ago. Now sealed off and used only to store broken benches and unused hymnals. She reached the wooden door, splintered, cold to the touch, and pushed gently. She descended toward it, passing through narrow stone corridors where time clung in layers. Cobwebs, forgotten murals. It creaked open into dust and shadow. The hearth was still there, tall, grand, built of river stone darkened by centuries of flame. But no fire had burned in it for 100 years or more. She approached. The air was dry and brittle, the scent of soot faint but stubborn. And there, tucked into the very heart of the fireplace, nestled beneath a half-burned piece of wood, was something small, round, dull red. An ember that wasn't. She leaned in. It wasn't warm. Not to her fingers. But when she held her breath and brought it close to her ear, she heard it, a faint crackle, the sound of a fire that had once roared, that had comforted hands and voices long vanished. That remembered. She lifted the petal. It was deeper in color than the other's red ochre, with flecks of gray and a shimmer of gold. On its surface, a mark, a single circle surrounded by short, radiating lines like a sun half buried beneath ash. This was the 6, and in that moment, the air in the hearth seemed to shift, not heat, to the embers that still dreamed, not cold. Something else, as if the hearth exhaled. She stepped back and bowed her head, whispering thanks to the unseen hands that had warmed themselves here, to the fire long gone. Then she turned and left the refectory. The petals were guiding her, not just to the garden, but through the very soul of the cathedral. And every petal returned meant another story remembered. Céleste placed the ember-colored petal into the 6th groove of the basin. The stone chamber dimmed, then pulsed again, brighter now, as if the bell were breathing more deeply with every note remembered. As she turned to the next, fresh script unfolded beneath her fingers. A shimmer spiraled faintly across its gold surface. The petals on the book's 6th page now glowed in soft, flickering hues. The 7th lies in the hour that never came, where time was promised but never passed. She frowned, lips parted slightly in wonder. The hour that never came. Her thoughts drifted toward one of the cathedral's strangest artifacts, an ancient clock set high into the east transept wall. Unlike the others, it had no hands. Only a ring of engraved numbers circling a polished face, as smooth and silver as a mirror. No mechanism, no ticking. The silent clock, it was called. Some said it had once worked, but it had not moved in living memory. No records told when or why it had stopped. No one had ever tried to fix it. It simply was. Frozen, like the petals had been. From there, a narrow wooden walkway curved out behind the rose window and wrapped around the east tower. She ascended the stairs again, higher this time, into a loft behind the organ pipes. The silent clock waited in shadow. Its surface reflected her candlelight as she approached. The numbers gleamed, perfect and untouched. Then, as she leaned closer, a shimmer. Just beneath the 12. She reached out, fingertips grazing the cool metal. And there, resting in a shallow dip, as though placed carefully by unseen hands, was a petal. This one was translucent, almost glass. Pale gray with a center of soft blue. When she touched it, she heard nothing. No song, no hum, just silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full. The way a snowfall fills the air with hush. As if for just a heartbeat it had moved. She turned it gently in her hand. On the underside, etched faintly, a circle. Split by a vertical line, no numbers, just the symbol for time paused. Céleste pressed it to her heart for a moment before placing it between the book's pages. Even as she turned to leave, the silent clock seemed to shimmer more brightly behind her. One tick. One step closer. Céleste returned to the hidden chamber, the translucent petal cupped gently in her palm. As she pressed it into the 7th indentation of the basin, the light around the bell shimmered once more cool blue, flowing into the ember's glow beside it, the colors rippling together like wind across silk. 7 petals now. Only 2 remained. And the silence was beginning to sing. The air in the room had changed. Not louder, just deeper, as though the chamber itself was breathing with her. She opened the book again. The page with the 7th petal now bore a swirl of symbols curved like musical notes, but not quite. Beneath it, a single line of script emerged, soft and pale. The 8th sleeps beneath forgotten feet, and song carved by solace and silence. It took her a moment. Then she remembered the staircase. Not the grand spiral or the bell tower's winding steps. No, this was the pilgrim's stair, a stone staircase sealed long ago, deep beneath the floor of the southern aisle, once walked by those who entered St. Celestine barefoot in penance. She had passed over its concealed hatch many times, never noticing the faint inscription near its base worn smooth by centuries of footfalls. She found it again, tucked behind an old confessional. The latch barely gave, but after careful work with a silver key from the library's archive ring, it opened with a low sigh. The air beneath was thick with dust and cool stone. She descended carefully. Each step sang, not with sound, but with memory-hollow tones that echoed not in her ears, but somewhere deeper in her chest. Her hands, the stairs led to a narrow corridor. At its end, a small chamber with mosaic tiles, broken and faded, but clearly once intricate. There, beneath a shallow alcove, was a stone slab, and in its center, a petal, soft pink, threaded with lines of violet gray, like the veins of a flower left too long in a pressed book. She couldn't read them, but somehow she understood. Céleste knelt and lifted it. Unlike the others, this one had texture, not smooth. Its surface was lined with faint etchings words in a language even older than the cathedral itself. They were footsteps, prayers whispered into the floor by pilgrims who never spoke aloud. She held it close. No sound emerged, but her heartbeat fell into rhythm with something slow, measured, sacred. The pulse of those who came before. When she returned to the chamber and placed the 8th petal into the basin, a soft breeze swept through the airless room, not from outside, from within. The petals rustled, the bell shivered, and one space remained. Just one. Then take one more breath in, slow and gentle. Hold it softly, then let it go like a ribbon on the wind. One remains, flickering just beyond the veil of silence, waiting to be found, waiting to come home. 8 petals have remembered. The basin before her shimmered with 8 gently glowing petals, each resting in their groove like musical notes written in silence. Céleste stood very still, the warmth from the basin reaching toward her hands. It didn't burn, it soothed, it welcomed. The chamber glowed faintly, as if lit not by flame, but by memory. The bell had changed. It no longer looked quiet. It looked patient. She opened the velvet-covered book once more, hands slow and reverent. There were no riddles on the 9th page, no rhyme, no puzzle to unwind. Just an image, drawn with the faintest lines of gold and gray. A candle, tall, unlit. She had seen it once before, as a child, behind a glass case in the old vestry. The candle of Saint Evian. Below it, a single line, return the flame that lit no room. Céleste traced the drawing with her fingertips. The candle was familiar, almost haunting in its simplicity. A relic no one ever touched. No one even dusted the case anymore. The story had always puzzled her. It was said that the candle had been lit during the hour of hollow winds, an especially bitter winter night, long before the cathedral was restored. Saint Evian, young and pale with grief, had placed it in the crypt and whispered a single prayer. The flame appeared, but went out before anyone could see it cast a shadow. Some said it never burned at all. Others said it lit the soul, not the room. The air was cool and dry. It smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender, and something older parchment, perhaps. Or time. Only the sound of her own soft footfalls echoed as she descended through the lower corridor, a passage so old it bore no frescoes, untouched, but suggestion, as though it remembered being lit once, long ago. Its wax pale as winter cream, its wick long and unused. Tucked against the far wall stood a tall glass case, carved from oak and framed with gilded corners worn smooth with age. Heart thudding with something soft and sacred. Only dark stone and the occasional flicker of a torch held by iron brackets. She closed the book, nothing, and began walking, which had appeared solid, revealed a tiny compartment. A panel just beneath the wax loosened, and from it something slid free. The halls of St. Celestin were quiet at this hour. As she walked, a hush fell over everything. Even the stone beneath her seemed to soften. She reached the vestry's wooden door and pushed it open slowly. Céleste felt something ripple through her chest like warmth, wrapping gently around sorrow, as though the petal didn't just hold silence. It held forgiveness, inside edged in ember gray. The room was narrow, lined with shelves holding dusty ceremonial robes, brass incense holders, and rows of forgotten hymnals. There it was, the candle of Saint Evian. Something shifted, tall. A faint golden shimmer danced across its smooth surface, not light. Céleste approached slowly. She lifted the latch of the glass with care. It creaked just slightly as she opened it, and then just stillness. She reached for the candle. As her fingers closed gently around its base, the whole vestry seemed to exhale. And then she realized it had always been the final petal, not because it was last in sequence, but because it asked nothing of her. It simply offered closure. The base of the candle, a single petal, soft gold, deep and ancient, stirred within the walls. It shimmered faintly in her palm. The 9th began to open, but it was more than just the final piece. As she held it, the last note in a song too tender to speak aloud. She closed her eyes. This not a beginning, but the piece just after an ending. When she returned to the hidden chamber beneath the rose window, the bell seemed to recognize her steps. It shimmered softly, awaiting its voice. Céleste placed the 9th petal into the final groove, and in that moment, no sound. Only a warmth the bell breathed, and the garden beneath the cathedral. The 9th petal rested in the final groove, its soft glow spreading in concentric rings across the basin. Each petal now pulsed in harmony with the others, a quiet rhythm that seemed more felt than seen, like the hush between words in a lullaby, or the slow inhale before sleep. Céleste stepped back, her heart open, her breath even. The bell above the basin remained still. No chime, no hum, only anticipation. The silence thickened, not heavy, but expectant, as if the chamber itself were holding breath. Then, without her touching it, the bell stirred. Once, a low vibration, too gentle to be called a sound, but enough to make the petals tremble faintly. The grooves they rested in shifted, almost imperceptibly, and then began to close. Not to hide them, but to carry them inward into the bell. One by one, each petal was drawn into the golden shell, disappearing like drops of water drawn into thirsty soil. Their glow remained, however, spreading across the surface of the bell in glowing veins. Then came a second pulse, a deeper tone like wind moving through a vaulted chamber. The air thickened, not with smoke or dust, but with memory, and the walls began to ripple. Céleste stood very still as the chamber transformed. The ivy-carved stone faded. The basin dissolved, the air shimmered, and she found herself standing in the center of a vast, walled garden beneath a starless twilight sky. The plants glowed faintly with their own light vines with lantern-shaped blossoms, moss that shimmered beneath her feet, trees with silver leaves that barely rustled, though no wind stirred them. She turned in slow wonder. The bell was still there, only now it stood taller, planted in the center of the garden like a tree without branches, its golden surface warm with the light of all 9 petals. And then it remembered. There was no clang, no strike. The bell simply resonated. A low, humming vibration spread outward from its core, reaching the moss, the lantern flowers, the trees, the earth, and finally her. Céleste felt it deep in her bones, the sound of lost footsteps on ancient staircases, of whispered prayers beneath vaulted ceilings, of candles snuffed out gently in windless halls, of old laughter, of sobs buried in cloisters of presence. She closed her eyes. The resonance grew, not louder but deeper, wider, warmer, and from the garden paths, shadows began to stir, but not the frightening kind. These were echoes, people, monks, nuns, pilgrims, singers, librarians, children, each moving slowly, reverently, among the garden paths. None spoke. They did not need to. Their presence sang. Her hands folded gently, her expression calm as dusk. One figure paused before Céleste, a woman in pale robes. She said no words, but her gaze held centuries. She bowed slightly, and Céleste bowed in return, spinning gently, light filtering through its panes, casting long bands of color across the path. And then the woman stepped aside. Behind her, a rose window stood, not built into a wall, but suspended in the air itself. Céleste stepped forward. The window pulsed, and in its glass she saw her own face. Young, yes, but behind her reflection, each place she had been. The candle in the vestry, the silent clock, the stone angel, the hearth. They had come home. The pilgrim's stare, each petal, each step, each echo. They weren't just relics, they were stories. And now she lifted a hand and touched the glass. The moment her fingers made contact, the bell hummed once more. And every soul in the garden, those quiet, flickering echoes, turned their gaze toward the sound, not in fear, in recognition. The bell had remembered. They were meant to be carried, shared, heard, and through its song, so had they. The petals, the paths, the prayers, they were never meant to be locked away. The garden wasn't just a place of memory. It was a sanctuary for what the world forgets. And now, thanks to her, it had been reawakened. She exhaled slowly, and the breath felt like something sacred, a letting go. A gentle yes to all that had been lost and found again. The garden shimmered in twilight, neither day nor night, a world between breaths, and this time, it didn't reflect her face. Lantern flowers glowed from their vines like stars woven into branches. Silver moss hummed beneath Celeste's feet as she stepped slowly toward the rose window, which now turned gently in the air like a floating mandala of stained glass memory. She reached toward it once more. It reflected a door, a wooden one, carved in a style she did not know, too old to be Romanesque, too curved to be Gothic. In its grain were markings like music, etched deep and soft, looping symbols, spirals of old script, and petals carved into the frame. The moment she saw it, she knew. Her eyes closed, her hair braided like vines. Heart steady, breath long. She held in her hands a book identical to the one Celeste carried. It was the last path, not to another petal. Céleste whispered, but to herself. Its golden surface still humming with the voices of the 9 petals, the bell opened. They were not wide with wonder or sadness. Each vein glowed with its own color snow silver. They hadn't vanished. They had simply come forward to listen. As if the petals, the cathedral, the bell, they were not holding memory for themselves. Moss green, the pages breathing with each slow movement of the figure's chest. But to carry memory forward is a calling. Petals parting like the blooming of a great celestial flower, and from within the bell came a warm, these story, pulsing light, ash gold, lantern blue. She turned slowly toward the garden's bell. It stood tall and rooted at the center of a perfect circle of stone, and as she watched, it didn't crack or break. Said the keeper, "Is only sleeping. The petals are fragments of memory, yes, but you were the one who gave them breath again." It unfolded. The golden surface rippled like water, and its center stood a figure. Not the same as the others. This one was whole, solid, a young woman dressed in gray robes, the woman said. Her voice like wind through cathedral rafters soft, the woman said, but only because he returned. Hollow, ancient, and young all at once. But this one shimmered faintly. Céleste stepped forward. When the woman opened her eyes, they were gentle, knowing. "I've been waiting. Who are you?" "I am the keeper." Céleste's gaze lowered to the book. They were never forgotten. The bell hummed low behind her. The rose window turned once more. Céleste glanced around the garden. The echoes still walked its paths, still smiled gently at her passing. They were waiting for someone to listen. "To remember is a gift," said the keeper, stepping forward. She reached out and pressed her book into Céleste's hands. And in that moment, the book in her own arms dissolved like mist, its stories, its ink, its pages flowing into the new one. Céleste opened it slowly, blank. Then a single line formed. Let the next echo begin. She looked up, but the keeper was gone. Only the bell remained, now closed once more, its petals gleaming gold in the garden's breathless twilight. The path behind her shifted. The garden was fading, not disappearing, returning. Like a tide, like a story that had finished one chapter and was ready for another. Céleste stepped back through the rose window, and the last thing she saw before the chamber returned was a single lantern flower blooming from the rim of the bell. The chamber returned around her, stone by stone, shadow by shadow. The glowing basin had dimmed now. The petals were gone, absorbed into the bell, but something in the air had changed. It felt lighter, not as if the weight had vanished, but as if it had been shared. Céleste stood in the hush for a while, her fingers resting on the book that was no longer old. Its leather cover had softened, as though worn by 100 years of hands. walked back soft as light on parchment, through the narrow hall, and ascended the spiral steps not literal, that once led her to the highest ledges of the cathedral. Her legs moved without thought now, her heart following the rhythm of the bell's last hum. It echoed faintly in her memory, not as a sound, but as a place she had visited and would return to often, even if only in dreams. Its pages remained blank, but still, she could feel something written between them, something waiting for ink. She above her, the loft near the rose window, was bathed in gentle morning light. It was morning. She hadn't realized how long she'd been gone. Perhaps she hadn't been gone long at all. Where once a clear pane had sat now shimmered a petal. Or maybe time had held its breath with her. The choir stalls below lay empty, still. Not a soul stirred in the nave. But when she looked toward the rose window, its great circular frame of stained glass shimmering in soft blues, ambers, and pale lilacs, something had changed. Her hand moved. In the very center, gold-edged, a symbol, but real enough to catch the light in a way that made her throat tighten. Like vines curling toward sunlight, she sat at the edge of the wooden railing and opened the new book. For the first time, she dipped her pen into ink without knowing what words would come. She did not look up, but paused briefly beneath the beam of colored light falling across the floor. And still not in fear, but in peace. The words emerged slowly. There was a bell that never rang. Until someone returned its voice, she smiled. Somewhere below, a faint rustle stirred. The old woman who swept the north aisle walked slowly beneath the rose window. Céleste wondered, would she feel it? Would others? Would they see petals in the corners of their eyes now, or hear music humming behind silence? Maybe, or maybe only those who had always listened. She closed the book and rested it in her lap. She didn't need to tell the whole story now. She had time. The bell had given her that. Her gaze drifted toward the morning. Doves circled above the spires. Sunlight passed through ancient glass and landed on the wood like spilled honey. And somewhere behind the hush of prayer and the echo of centuries, a garden waited, not buried, not hidden, just remembered. Years passed, the cathedral remained. People came and went, pilgrims with aching knees, lovers whispering vows, children laughing through sunlit aisles. The rose window still held its place high above the choir, casting ribbons of color across the floor every morning. Most admired it. Few noticed the soft shimmer at its center, the golden petal tucked within. Céleste stayed. Not forever, but long enough. Then librarian, then keeper of the vestry, she walked gently. They would lean in and whisper, spoke softly. Her presence became part of the cathedral's rhythm like candlelight, or the hush before a hymn. She was not famous, and remembered. No plaque bore her name. What's that in the center? She took on the role of archivist at first, but if you asked the choir boys, they would say she knew every creak of the wood. If you asked the nuns, they would say she never needed to check a key twice. Now much older, stepped beside her without a word. And if you asked the very old, late at night, when the candles burned low and no one else stirred, she would sit near the choir loft and open her old book. She listens to things that aren't quite gone. Sometimes, when the light was thin and the air smelled of stone and old pages, still blank, but she never needed to read it. She simply ran her fingers across its pages. The bell never rang aloud again. But those who truly listened swore they heard something on quiet mornings, especially in winter, a hum, a breath. Many years later, a young girl entered the cathedral during a storm. She wore a rain-soaked coat and carried a tiny notebook. She wandered, lost, until she stood beneath the rose window and looked up, mouth slightly open, raindrops still dripping from her cuffs, like petals brushing against gold. And once Céleste, the girl asked, and the old woman smiled, she said softly, "Memory," beneath that great bloom of colored glass. With doves cooing in the rafters and thunder whispering beyond the stone walls, She began to tell it all again. Would you like to know its secret? And so, as it was meant to be told, gently, slowly, like a bell that had only just begun to ring,